Now, a lot of you are chemical conscious out there, and I want to talk about how to plant a food plot without chemicals. And we're going to talk about some of the risk and reward of doing so. And really, ultimately, you have to assess a balance. And I'll give an example right here. We're not even going to talk about if this farmer is using chemicals or not at this moment, but you can see a lot of locations that are continually not using chemicals in their fields, they have to actually disc and till often, plow often. What that does is, we're in a hill country, and this is not a great hill. I'm looking at the top of this right up here going to the ag field is probably about 15 feet higher in elevation, maybe 100 yards away from where I'm standing. But with repeated disking, you can see this is an area where everything drains right through here. And so you can see the weed growth that comes in. And we've actually had trenches going through the soil, and this is on our property right here. And you can see with that repeating disking and tilling and plowing, how all those weeds have actually come down off of this land, and they're into this area right here, and that's actually smothered some of our switchgrass. We're spraying this, we're gonna have to reseed a little bit, try to fill this area in. We actually had corn growing in this spot and a bunch of other locations on the property when we've had those repeated disking and tillings and plowing in here. And I bring that up because that's one way to plant food plots. I have some friends in Wisconsin, and every year what they're doing, they don't want to use chemicals, so they're plowing or disking 2 to 4 times a year, 4 times with plowing sometimes, and 3 times with plowing and disking. So disking 2 to 3 times and then plowing. They're turning that soil over, and that's allowing them to keep their weeds at bay. The problem is, in areas like this, and boy, probably 50% of the country where you have a little bit of elevation change, you really open your soil up for erosion. You open it up for drying out the soil, ripping up the soil, and then creating this weed bank right here that eventually forms in some of these runoff areas. And so you have to really consider these balances. Yes, you don't use chemicals. I want to look at one of the things that there's a no-till farm around here that I know. He talks about they take soil samples 2 to 3 inches down, and then 3 to 10 inches down. And when you compare those two, all the organic matter and all the nutrients are in those top 2 to 3 inches. Now they'll outperform their neighborhood as far as the tilling neighbors go and plowing neighbors go significantly. And they're using no-till, but it's because they're only working on that top 2 to 3 inches of the soil. That's all you need to actually have a good crop and to actually grow. So that's kind of some good and bad about tilling and disking. Now there's ways to plant food plots without chemicals or tilling or disking. And so we talk about crop rotations. We started doing a long time ago was we'd take wheat, and then we'd, or rye, and then we'd broadcast beans into soybeans, and then we would actually mow the rye or wheat, and then you get a crop of beans coming in. It's not a bad way to do with beans. Can't do that with corn. We actually tried it right out here. We actually got a few ears of corn doing that, where we actually terminated the rye. The rye helps suppress weed growth. Wheat does too going into the spring a little bit, less than rye though. And then so you suppress weed growth, and then you're planting into it. Now we mowed, which isn't as even. You can use a crimper, and that gets into even Packer Max that we partner with has a crimper that they can use, an ATV crimper that crimps over that rye, because buckwheat really is the only crop that you can use where you can just run it right over with tires, or we use our Packer Max called a Packer, and it rolls it right over flat. But you can plant into and rotate crops that way. Again, we started doing that probably 15, 18 years ago with the wheat and rye and beans. The problem is with something like that is it works well with beans. That's something you can plant in the, say, June. You can't plant corn into it and get a yield for how expensive the corn is, not using chemicals on it to spray weed control. You don't get any kind of appreciable yield with corn. So really what you're left with is when you have that rye or wheat going into the springtime, you're left with only being able to plant beans into it, because if you let it go to seed head, you have hundreds of times more rye seed or wheat seed going into the fall than you want. And a lot of times it drops down too soon. So let's say that drops August 1st. and you're in an area that's central Midwest, even southern Illinois, somewhere where you shouldn't be planting rye until the end of September, middle of September, well, that seed head gets down in the ground in August, and all of a sudden you're getting rye growing up that's not attractive or usable to deer going into the hunting season. So very, very poor crop. So you really want to terminate that rye to begin with, but planting into it, about the only thing you can really plant into it are beans for the summertime. And so if you're not planting beans, you have some summer crops available that you can actually put a summer blend in and have that summer blend going in. And some of those, like a buckwheat, is awesome. We've planted a lot of buckwheat into standing rye around June 1st, just spreading it right in. We terminate the rye, get rid of it. You can mow it over the top. The bottom line is that buckwheat will take hold really well, but not everyone should be planting buckwheat. You know, that's a great way if you want to plant buckwheat. The problem is weeds still get in. And so if you have a lot of weeds competing with a buckwheat, competing with any summer food source, you lack volume, you lack that. Buckwheat's a great smother crop, but if you don't have that smother crop ability, and that smother crop comes from a completely shaded canopy, if you have weeds mixed in, you don't get that shaded canopy. So then you don't get the whole benefit of the buckwheat that you're trying to achieve. So you put that soybean in. Not everywhere should have a summer food source. For example, out here, we do not want a summer food source. Buckwheat is very marginal compared to the alfalfa out here, so they don't hit the buckwheat. Even when I was in the UP of Michigan, I had 8.5 acres of buckwheat at times during the summertime. The deer didn't hammer all the buckwheat because they had so much other forage during the summertime they didn't need to hit the buckwheat. So much food, 5 times more than deer actually could consume. So with that buckwheat, it's a great smother crop. But even there, it's not appropriate for all properties. Beans are not appropriate for all properties. So on one risk, you have the erosion, tilling, disking, plowing you have to consider, and the weeds that come from that. You can see that right here. And I want to give you a little tidbit. These farmers right here use multiple herbicide sprayings and pesticide. So that's thousands of acres around here and everywhere. And even with that, look at the weeds that are right here. Look at the weeds that are down here. This is ridiculous here because of the weeds. This is the runoff. You can see the switchgrass behind. Weeds, no weeds. No weeds, weeds. You can see with this erosion and where it valleys them. So that's a big risk. The other risk is not everyone needs to plant a summer food source, even if you could. And when you have summer food, that can create a dough factory. So that's a really bad thing, meaning that if we plant summer food out here, which we do not, beans or anything, we don't want the deer here appreciable, because then we have an army of does and fawns waiting. We push our deer herd numbers up. We push our population of deer out of balance with the habitat. That pushes bucks off the property, so it destroys our herd management goals, destroys our hunting goals. And if bucks aren't living here because of the extreme amount of does and fawns on the property, then why are they going to come back even during the rut? The answer is they don't, or they don't to a very high percentage. So that's a big risk too. You can do some summer rotations without using chemicals, but then the summer food that you actually plant or are hoping to plant might not be a good thing. And if you use a kitchen sink blend, summer blend, you have 15 different seeds. They're all supposed to do different things. Well, if deer eat 5 out of 15 seeds, if 5 out of 15 don't grow because they're suppressed by weeds, because again, you're not spraying. If the other 5 that are standing are spaced out and the deer don't want them, they don't really do much to your soil because they're spread out, then what good is that too? And just because you can seed into it in the fall. So the problem is erosion, the weeds that can come up, even if you're disking and tilling, and this is an example of that, even people that use weeds, using summer sources that aren't appropriate for you, planting summer food plots that aren't appropriate, and then finally, when you get into the fall, we want green blends that are high volume. We have 17.5 acres out of 255 on this property. In Wisconsin, out of that 40 acres, with 30 of it being woods, we have about 3.25 acres of food. We have to, doesn't matter if we're here in Minnesota or Wisconsin, we have to have every acre working for us. If we have weeds mixed within that blend going into the fall, now we have a fraction, 10%. We need 10 acres to equal an acre of what we do now. The bottom line is there's a lot of rotations you can do. A lot of those rotations we've been practicing for many decades. using chemicals, not using chemicals, and assessing the balance. And that's what's really key to figure out in this. See, when you're food plotting, when we go to a client and we have a prescription for success, we have to be right. We have to base on experience. We have to look at, you're using X amount of time, X amount of dollars to plant these food plots. You're using resources to clear the land. You need to get acre for acre. You can't have a fraction going in. And in the fall, that's great if we plant this side in beans, this side in winter rye and wheat, and we move the two back and forth. On the side that we're planting wheat in the fall, we can put a summer blend in there. But if the summer blend is poor, if it's bringing deer in we shouldn't have, if you're allowing weeds to grow, if we have to actually use beans, it creates a dough factory, then we're actually stepping backwards in what it does for deer. We'd be better off just planting clover and a few little hunting plots, leaving the land alone, having a poor deer herd, not a lot of bucks, not a lot of deer numbers, and therefore a poor deer hunt. Why'd you buy the land in the first place? So smart food plotting. It's not a no chemical or chemical answer. It's obviously with no chemicals, there's not a lot of advantages. You end up getting a lot of poor actually results. It doesn't matter if you're using summer food or you're using poor quality fall foods because of that. You're lacking volume. At the same time, you don't want to have to spray 5 or 6 times on your land every year. You don't want to disc repeatedly and rip up the soil. Just work on that top 2 to 3 inches. That's all you need to work on. So disking, tilling, plowing is a bad thing. So there's a lot of risks that you have to assess overall. You have to consider all factors, even using the machine and using fuel and using it over and over and over again. So what we choose to do is limit our chemical use as much as possible, and then use a pure smother crop like buckwheat during the summertime to put nutrients back. We're actually fall seeding oats or spring seeding oats and rye for about a 6-week period, 7-week period, and then we'll terminate it, plant corn into it, plant buckwheat into it, and that helps us limit our actual chemical use. We're not using any pesticides like the farm fields out here. So what we choose to do is actually limit the amount of chemicals, and for that, find true balance and actually have good fall plots that equal a high volume of food per acre while we're limiting weed growth. That's best all around. I hope you can understand that balance. It's not that we want to use chemicals, it's just that we need to use chemicals. And it's not based on our equipment either. I can use any equipment I want. I can get anything I wanted planted for free out here. We could probably get equipment like that nice Polaris Kinetic back there loaned to us for the year for free from whatever company we have as far as tractors, anything we want. So we can do anything we want out here, but we want to do something that actually fits with the bulk of our clients, viewers, readers' needs, and limiting the amount of chemicals, limiting the amount of equipment they need. Why buy a $70,000 tractor and setup, or a $20,000 grain drill, or $15,000 grain drill? Maybe even a $6,000 crimper or $5,000 crimper or $10,000 in addition to this big tractor. You don't need that stuff. You can have great food plots, no-till, working on that top layer of soil, working on your weeds, balancing everything involved. You don't have to use a fuel. You don't have to use those big machines. Consider everything you need to balance. Machines, your time, your money, fuel, erosion, drying out the soil. You plow down 12 inches, 10 inches, you're just putting poor ground up on top. Consider all those balances when you go out to food plot this year, and you might find that there's no right answer, no chemicals or chemicals. It's just about being smart with your food plot planting. And when you actually look at being smart, being right, being wise, and using experience to actually grow and build and a herd and build your soil at the same time, you'll find a little bit of chemicals goes a long ways, and not using chemical is just plain not very smart. Guys, it's food plot time, and I really urge you to check out our food plot company, Pure Wildlife Blends. It's called Pure for a reason. I invite you to check it out. We have food plot blends for all types, and we try to give you all this content on YouTube, articles on the site, to help you make sure you not only do it right, plant it right, but you pick the right seed blend for your circumstances.